So, hello and good morning. I hope you can all see the slides. This morning session is about how the European Commission identifies and tackles climate change disinformation. Next slide. I'm Jens Linge. I'm the leader of the disinformation team at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And I will present later on the data-driven analysis of disinformation narratives. Here with me, I have three speakers from the European Commission. Istvan Perger, who is head of sector at the Commission's Communication Directorate in Brussels. Istvan is leading the team in charge of the network against disinformation, amongst many other communication activities. We'll have a presentation by Hendrik Bruns. Hendrik is a policy analyst at the Joint Research Center and behavioral and environmental economist who will show us his latest experiments on behavioral insight. And our fourth speaker is Laura Smiley. Laura is a policy analyst at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Laura is leading the multi-annual research program Enlightenment 2.0 and has published extensively on the science policy interface. She's going to talk about meaningful and ethical communication. We will have 4 presentations and hopefully have enough time for questions and discussion afterwards. We will collect also questions in the chat, and then come back to you afterwards. Misinformation and disinformation, of course, is a huge field and has really moved in the spotlight due to COVID-19, also the Russian aggression against Ukraine. In a nutshell, we differentiate between misinformation and disinformation. Disinformation is deliberately intended to deceive, and that is really the main difference here. Sometimes we use misinformation or disinformation as a passport photo, so just as a disclaimer. As disinformation is such a big field, my colleague Laura has prepared a slide with a summary of several activities at the European Commission to give you the big picture before we move on to the 4 presentations. Thank you. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Jens. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joining us today. Delighted that you can all be with us. If I could have the next slide, please.
It's still in the same presentation.
That would be splendid. Thank you so much. So really importantly, just let me start by explaining that really, particularly disinformation has been on the EU's political agenda since 2015. Next slide, please. And I'm going to basically be just giving an outline, but particularly with regards to the European Commission's initiatives. This is obviously not dealing with the sort of the more external action, the European External Action Services initiative, which are specifically looking at malicious foreign interests and or the many activities of either the Council or the European Parliament. But really, this has been on the Commission's agenda, as I mentioned, since 2015. Now, this kind of started back in 2018 with the initiation of the first Code of Practice on Disinformation, where many of the industry players signed up to a Code of Practice. This has subsequently been strengthened and revised to reflect a much broader stakeholder group and with a much more ambitious agenda. And together with, as many of you I'm sure are aware, with the recently adopted and published into law Digital Services Act, this is actually creating the combination of these 2 legislative instruments is creating a co-regulatory framework to be able to address any kind of systemic risks associated with disinformation. In at the end in November of 2021, we also, the Commission also proposed a regulation on the transparency for targeting of political advertising. So very specifically, as this was not addressed particularly under the Digital Services Act, so really specifically addressing political advertising, recognising the potential that this has in terms of possibly damaging the democratic discourse during particularly sensitive times and election periods. Which brings us to other mechanisms that the Commission has been developing, such as the European Cooperation Network on Elections. This is a longer standing initiative, but this has been given additional mechanisms and additional and strengthened powers to enable the optimal exchange, including issues of disinformation between the member states, particularly at key electoral times. And then in 2020, we had the establishment of what is called the European Digital Media Observatory, an important initiative that is founded at member state level, but is an important network of researchers, academics, and fact checkers who are able to give a very important national perspective to what's happening on the ground, with the aim in the medium to longer term to be learning shared lessons learned and to be working collaboratively across member states. In addition to this, there's obviously numerous media literacy initiatives. And then of course we have the internal mechanism, which is the Network Against Disinformation, which comprises many different directorates general across the Commission. And this is an ideal moment for me to be able to pass the floor to my colleague Istvan, who will be able to explain a bit more about the context of this Network Against Disinformation, how it's working and how it's being led by DG Com.
Yeah, first we'll have the presentation from JRC on, if you could please change back to the first presentation. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. Now it's called the Linge_3. Sorry for that. If you could change the slides to the previous presentation, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Yes, excellent. So my presentation is on a data-driven approach, really to retrieve and analyze mis and disinformation. And for data retrieval, we are using in-house tools developed by JRC over the last 15 years, really. First of all, for media monitoring, we use Europe Media Monitor. I'm sharing the publicly available link here, where we scan roughly 400,000 news items per day. For social media, we are looking at the Twitter Enterprise API, and we do monitor Telegram and Reddit. We don't have access to Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, so we are basically a bit driven by a bias to that information that is easily accessible to us. Thirdly, we look at sites that were indicated to us by independent fact-checking organizations as frequently spreading mis and disinformation. And the fact-checkers have worked with us to compile this list, and we retrieve the text items from these sites and base our analysis on this. Last but not least, we are also looking at the fact-checkers themselves to get really the latest fact checks. So that can be from dedicated organizations, NGOs, but also from the big publishing houses who publish their own fact checks. Next slide. For monitoring climate change, we have started with clustering clustering used to identify really the most frequent narratives. So we basically compiled a list of all the narratives that we could identify, and then we arranged them in 3 levels, and we call these levels super narrative, narrative, and sub-narrative, really from the big picture to the more detailed sub-narrative. And here I give 2 examples. So criticism of climate policies is a very important super narrative. There are very, very frequent mentions of these narratives. Then on the narrative level, it would be impact on the economy, and on the sub-narrative level, it would be climate policies are too costly. So that's something that we frequently see in items on the text items that we retrieve from the web. Another example would be downplaying climate change. The narrative would be CO2 concentrations are too small to have an impact. And here actually we don't have a more fine-grained sub-narrative, so we stay at this narrative level for our annotation. So what we do is we get hundreds or thousands of text items, and we annotate them according to such a code book. And here I give a couple of examples. So you can see in the first column on the left, the super narratives, in the central column, the narratives, and on the right, the sub-narratives. And what we see rather frequently as conspiracy theories, so blaming the global elites, anti-Soros would be a common sub-narrative. Yeah. Jumping to the last row, questioning the measurements. So there are many items, text items that question, for example, the sea level rise or the temperature increase. Yeah, and I put here an asterisk because that's also one of the narratives that my colleague Hendrik will talk about later, and he has included that in his presentation, as I understand. If you want to work with us on the code book, we are really happy to work with anyone to expand the number of sub-narratives, narratives, super narratives, and I give here the email address where you can reach us. So we are happy for any kind of collaboration, also academic collaboration, really to get this as complete as possible. Next slide. So now I give 2 examples. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, criticism of policies against climate change is rather frequent. So here a text bit would be about the fine print for me. Sorry. So the narrative would be that it's unsustainable and ineffective. Yeah, and we had several text items here, that question the environmental sustainability of wind turbines. They were depicted as bird-killing devices. There was a study that was allegedly demonstrating the impact on bird species. And what we did, we looked up also the fact checks on the wind turbines and on the bird deaths, and actually we found in the fact check that puts it in perspective, because obviously wind turbines do kill birds, but the numbers have to be really put into the context. So cats, building class, auto collisions, power line collisions also kill considerable amounts of birds, and wind turbines are actually rather at the lower end when you look at the statistics, and this can be then passed on to communications experts. On the next slide, in the second example, you can see the super narrative downplaying climate change. And the narrative would be climate cycles are natural. And here we saw the Dutch unverified sources asserted that human CO2 emissions are not the main cause of the environmental changes, pointing at cosmic phenomena such as magnetic fields. So here we got the URL, and we got the summary from that article. Again, we also got a fact check on the same topic. And there are many on this topic because it's rather frequent. So the fact check basically says that several independent lines of scientific evidence based on observational data sets and modeling indicate that current climate change is driven by human emissions of greenhouse gases such as CO2. So again, what we can do is from the data, we can go to the individual text items that we retrieved, sum this up, give the URLs to the fact checks, and as a package pass it on to fact checking experts, such as Isvan, who's presenting after me. Next slide. Just a little bit of trend analysis, since we have been looking at that for quite a long time. As I said earlier, climate policies are inefficient, flawed is one of the largest super narratives. I just want to show you that we are able to do this kind of trend analysis. So really see any changes, observe any changes over time. I apologize for the fine print, but I really just wanted to focus on the evolution and the larger super narrative here. Next slide. As a research project, we're also looking at images and memes. So frequently shared this week was this one about COP27. We looked it up. It's actually from the Daily Telegraph, so I give the copyright here. When we run OCR on it, optical character recognition, actually we do get the text out of it, but the lines actually not formatted correctly. But that shows you that with an automated setup such as this, you could get the top 10 memes, do OCR, and annotate the text that you encounter. Next slide. Likewise, we had a look at the most frequently shared images. So this is from Miami Beach. It's an older image that is widely shared. I've seen it, for example, on The Guardian already back in 2019 or so. And here we can look for digital forgeries, because obviously Miami Beach has not been photographed like that. So we can do a JPEG ghost analysis to detect different levels of quantization in compressed images. Next slide. We can also look at noise inconsistencies, and then we find out that this is photoshopped, which we knew already beforehand, but it's a confirmation that these methods that can be applied automatically actually do work. So to sum up, what we do is we retrieve thousands of text items per week. We annotate them according to our code book, and we basically cluster them, annotate them, and pass them on to communications experts in Brussels. And this is used then for pre-bunking, debunking, and for communication materials such as briefs and newsletters. So we really hope that this data-driven approach leads also to a faster reaction time and to really better communication tools eventually. And with that, I would like to pass on to my colleague Istvan. Over to you. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. So, as it was pointed out by Jens, we work in the European Commission. There is a Directorate General for Communication. This is what DG stands for. And we try to detect disinformation narratives and then propose counter narratives to them. So this is the workflow on the screen. What you can see, we receive data from JRC, our colleagues here, the other presenters, and then we analyze we select from their data those which are absolutely relevant for our internal reporting. We add our own intelligence that is mostly coming from, well, on the one hand, from our internal sources in DG Com headquarters in Brussels, on the other hand, from the representations. The European Commission has representations in all of the member states of the European Union. So we receive all these data, and then we try to summarize the narratives we are faced with, disinformation narratives, and then propose counter narratives with fact checks. And this is what is being used overall in the Commission by Commission services. On the next slide, what we see is the depiction of the scheme of the network against disinformation. This network has already been mentioned by my colleagues. It is there since 2018, so it started even before the COVID crisis. This network brings together knowledge within the Commission and also beyond. This gathers different Commission services working on this information, and the aim is that it's ensured that the work is coordinated and information is shared efficiently. We have speakers from outside of the Commission also, but mostly we have speakers from within the DG Communication and beyond, from other Directorates General, but also from EAS, the European External Action Service, European Parliament, various European agencies, and also from academia. We have several speakers. And here you can see the scheme. And this network also publishes an internal report bi-weekly. We have one on the situation in Ukraine, for example, and all the related disinformation. And we have another newsletter or an internal report which deals with various disinformation narratives in the fields of migration or health, like the vaccination, and climate change. On the next slide, we see this structure, and also you can see what kind of Directorates General are mostly involved. It depicts also the situation that various subgroups of this network against disinformation are attended by different Directorates General, colleagues from different departments of the European Commission, and also by different agencies and experts. We are also in charge in DG Com for major corporate campaigns, and this is one of the examples is visible on the next slide. Is the UREU campaign. This is to communicate to citizens how overcoming the energy challenge is also key to upholding European values. So our purpose with this campaign is to show citizens that accelerating the green transition goes hand in hand with standing up for values such as the belief in democracy, peace, human rights, and freedom. So most important EU values. And we also aim to engage citizens on these topics by reinforcing a shared sense of European identity. And this is summed up in this phrase, "You are EU." We would also like to encourage citizens to play their part in the transition by making conscious choices when it comes to protecting the environment and saving energy. And let me show you another campaign. Over the next 3 years, so it has already started, our cooperation with the UEFA, so the Football Association. There will be clips advertised on television, social media, and football stadiums in 57 countries worldwide. And this will take place during the men's and women's UEFA Champions League matches, Europa League, and UEFA Youth Leagues. And the whole campaign will culminate shortly before the Euro 2024 Football Championship in Germany. And again, this is part of our efforts to communicate on the importance of the green transition as part of the European Green Deal. This is also a joint venture with UEFA, and it also demonstrates our partners' commitment to the European Climate Pact, which is an EU-wide initiative inviting people, communities, and organizations to participate in climate action and to build a greener Europe. And I would ask my colleagues to actually show you this video clip. So this version of this clip is... so with this clip and similar clips that will come up later on, our aim is to draw attention to the issue of climate change and also ways to tackling it. And getting back to the very first topic, so we are also very grateful to our colleagues in JRC. So what we really try to do is to bring expertise together from various available services at the disposal of the European Commission and also outside experts, academia, etc., so that we can really detect and respond to disinformation narratives. And thank you very much. I'm giving it back to Jens.
Thank you, Istvan. Yeah, if there are any questions, please have a look at the chat. We can collect your questions and get back to you later. Without further ado, I would hand over to my colleague Hendrik, who's going to talk about behavioral insight. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jens. So while I wait for the slides to come up, I'll say that I'm very, very thankful to be able to give this presentation here at the COP27 side event. We are now from DG Com back to DG JRC, and I would like to present to you some experimental findings or some experiments that we did at the European Commission, or in order to find out how we can foster resilience, people's resilience against climate change misinformation. And how can we basically teach people to spot misinformation, and how can we best debunk false narratives on climate change? No, please stay at the previous slide. So this is our main focus. So we want to look at why do people share and believe climate change misinformation. And we will see that there are various reasons and things that correlate with this. So I will talk about some in more detail on the next 10 slide. But before that, the reason why we are looking also at the reasons why people share and believe misinformation is that we think, and that we strongly argue, that whatever the main reason for believing or sharing misinformation is for people, for us to know these reasons will affect what we think is the best strategy in order to help people protect themselves against misinformation. So concretely, and that's what we'll see later, is how can we best pre-bunk or debunk climate change misinformation. So on the next slide, I show you some very, very inside views from Commission colleagues, or survey with Commission colleagues, so where I asked colleagues, what do you think, what is the main reason for people to share misinformation? And we gave them three possible alternatives. So people might be confused, they might think an article is true, even though it is false, but they might not realize it as such. They might be convinced that it is important to share this information, and they don't even care if it's false, because it is actually saying what they believe is in fact true. And they might be inattentive, so they might actually not realize that they're sharing misinformation because all their attention is directed towards other things, for example, gathering likes. You see here how colleagues at the European Commission thought what would be the main reasons. If you click once, please, you see that from an article in Nature by Gordon Pennycook et al., they found actually a different priority list of reasons that actually many people share misinformation because they're inattentive, because they care for other things rather than veracity. It's not so much important now to take away from this slide the distribution or the percentage here, but rather we argue that so whatever the reason why people share or believe in misinformation, this has important implication for how to best protect people against misinformation. If someone is confused, you need to help them reduce this confusion. If someone is really convinced by something, you need to convince them via other means. If someone is inattentive towards the veracity of a statement, you need to direct their attentiveness towards the veracity of a statement. And there are more reasons than this. On the next slide, please, you can see that in our experiments, naturally, we are focusing on the reason why people share. One of the reasons why people share misinformation might that they don't have much trust in different institutions. One of these institutions can be the European Union. This is, for example, what we are interested in. So if you click once more, please, I'll show you some statistics from an experiment in which we asked people, or which we measured people's trust in the European Union. And you can see here the bar graphs on the top. You always see, you will see people's beliefs, average beliefs in misinformation and climate change misinformation. In fact, for people that are high in trust in the European Union, and on the light blue bar graph, you see this average belief in misinformation for people who have relatively low or average belief in the European Union. And you see here that on average, people with higher beliefs in Europe, with higher trust in the European Union tend to believe in the misinformation articles that we showed them. And Jens talked to you or gave you some examples about the different narratives that exist, that these beliefs are tending to be lower. One additional click, please. You see in the middle the same outcomes for people who actually share misinformation in order to tell others, look, this is misinformation, this is wrong. Here, people who are higher in trust tend to be more likely to disagree with misinformation publicly towards others. If you click once more, you see the same graph for people endorsing misinformation. So the problem telling or sharing misinformation, but actually not acknowledging that it is misinformation. So sharing it because they think it is true. Here, there is no real difference between people who are trusting or not trusting the European Union. On the right-hand side, however, you see that on average, people with more trust in the European Union, they tend to think or to perceive these misinformation articles on climate change that we showed them are less credible. So the main point here on this slide is just there are differences in some aspects where there's a difference between people high in Euro trust and low in EU trust. We will focus now, one click please, on the left-hand side. So just to have one focus point, we see on the next slide, please, how in our experiment pre-bunks and debunks that we show to people reduce their belief in the different misinformation articles. And what we do is we give people pre-bunks, so we explain to them what are strategies commonly used by misinformation. They appeal to conspiracies. They pretend one scientific article is proof that every prior research was wrong, for example. This is what we tell people before we show them the climate change misinformation. Others, they see a debunk, which comes after they see misinformation and tells them, this is true. What you just saw was not correct. These are the reasons. These are the strategies being used. And we show this once just plainly the pre-bunk and the debunk, or some people we show these pre-bunks and debunks as obviously coming from the European Commission. Okay, so they are marked as a pre-bunk or debunk coming from the European Commission. And we did this with a bit more than 2,600 people. So everyday people from 4 different countries, Germany, Greece, Ireland, and Poland. And on the next slide, you can now see on the left-hand side, we just saw this, this graph, so the belief in misinformation. And on the right-hand side, you now see how does this belief in misinformation and the climate change misinformation articles we show to people change, get reduced, if they also received one of the 4 different interventions that we showed them. So the orange shaded ones are the pre-bunks, and the blue colored ones are debunks. We don't have to go into all the details here, the percentages or the difference. The main message is all of these different interventions work. Okay, so they all work in reducing people's belief in the climate change claims equally well. Interestingly, if the debunks or pre-bunks are coming from the European Commission, they still work for people who don't trust the European Union much. They work equally well. This is good news actually for the European Commission, because it tells us that still it makes an impact, not just for people who are very, very convinced or very, very trusting of the European Union, for example. And this is also the main points here on the findings slide. So all interventions reduce beliefs in the climate change claims, so beliefs. I did not present to you the evidence regarding affecting people's intention to share misinformation, because there it's a bit more nuanced. So there we have to dig a bit deeper into the data analysis in order to find out if these findings still hold, because in general, it's in our findings a bit easier to change or to reduce people's beliefs in the false climate change articles, rather than sharing their intentions to share these articles for different reasons. Also, the interventions, and I didn't show that to you either, were quite effective in reducing the credibility that people assigned to these different articles. Good news as well. And so the last point, which I think is one of the most important, but this is also more looking ahead, because we have to, like I said, dig a bit deeper into the data analysis and to really find a nuanced statement on whether trust in the EU might still change effectiveness of its pre and debunks. For example, when the goal is to reduce people's sharing intentions of wrong wrong climate change articles or increase their calling out of false narratives. So there is something that we will do in the future and look a bit deeper into that. So with this, I thank you very much again, and I would now give the floor to my colleague Laura, who was also involved in this project and who has some very interesting insights from her work to share with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Hendrik. May I have the slides up, please, colleagues? Super, thank you very much indeed. So we've had this great insight as to how the Commission is operating a sort of data-driven approach, and all of the systems that have been developed and put in place by Jens, how Istvan and his team and colleagues in both at headquarters of the Commission, but also in the representations, are doing this amazing job of translating this kind of evidence and on the ground insights and translating that into meaningful campaigns. And then we've heard from Hendrik about this sort of more vertical specific research initiatives. The work that I'm doing is looking more broadly at what are the different drivers of political decision making. And of course, in the midst of all of this, mis and disinformation is playing a kind of key role. And so the kind of evidence that we are gaining, which is very interdisciplinary in nature, can feed into many of these different vertical types of initiatives in order to help enhance many of these different decisions that are being taken. Could I have the next slide, please? Just one click. Thanks so much. So we started out under the multi-annual research program that I'm heading up with, basically identifying sort of the key issues for 21st century decision-making and policy-making and understanding our political nature. We then took a deep dive into understanding the role of technology and democracy, and in particular looking at online environments such as social media. We're looking at values and identities and the roles that they play. And right now, we are looking at meaningful and ethical communications. I will be focusing initially on key outputs from technology and democracy, although it was published in 2020. It was such a rich initiative with the co-coordinating lead authors being both myself and Professor Stephen Lewandowski, and we were very fortunate to have a raft of outstanding other experts who very kindly contributed to this initiative. These still hold true. These are insights that are important. And then I'll be explaining a little bit about meaningful and ethical communications and how we're making this link really importantly to the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So when in terms of managing the online world from a regulatory perspective, if you're looking at this from an institutional perspective, you can either look at things from an actor's perspective, which would be understanding the nature of the platforms, in which case you're often running after many of the actors trying to play catch up. You can look at it from a content perspective, which is a bit like playing, whack-a-mole in terms of, oh, that needs to be stopped, or that's wrong, that can be debunked. Or of course, you can also look at it from a behavioral perspective, which is we understand a lot about human behavior. And as a consequence, we're going to be understanding how behavior might actually change in the online world and the ramifications of this. Next slide, please. So our focus today is on this particular approach that we've taken to actually understanding behavior. Next slide, please. So very briefly, the methodology I've already explained, that we were working with world-renowned cognitive psychologists. We were looking at experts in complexity science, computational social scientists, constitutional lawyers, very important, but also those working in mathematics, network science, as well as fundamental rights, but also ensuring that we had philosophers in the room who were experts both in societal implications of artificial intelligence, as well as the ethical issues around that as well. So those were the profiles of the experts that we had the pleasure and privilege of working with. In terms of framing here, importantly, we recognize there are a myriad of advantageous benefits to come from technology, But given that we were looking at the actual potential harm and causality between the online platforms and democracies, we are on the more negative side in this particular area. Next slide, please. Why? Because, well, a functioning democracy depends on the ability of its citizens to make informed decisions. So really, what we're wanting to try and understand, consequently, is the role that mis and disinformation could potentially be playing in this democratic process. And we have evidence, next slide, please, that shows that social media can have a causal effect on people's political behaviours, including such activities, dangerous activities and behaviours as inciting hate crimes. So we need to keep this in mind, that these are not throwaway comments and that these really have very true ramifications. Just click through the next couple of slides. Yep, next one, thanks. So I won't go into the details. I'll share the links for the various reports in the chat afterwards. But what we have shown is that the online world is cognitively unique. Now that sounds a little bit like a throwaway comment, but what we're saying is we are thinking differently online. And this is due to the structure and the functionality of the online world that we find ourselves in, but also due to perceptions and our online behavior. And as a consequence, we have very specific psychological responses in the online world that we do not have offline. And so understanding this is absolutely fundamental. And of course, we kind of all have L plates up. We're beginners in this. We don't have centuries and centuries of learning to come with us, and the baggage and that we have learned and been passed down throughout the years. This is very, very new, and we're not very good at it. And so what we really need to understand is that as a consequence to our vulnerabilities, there are key pressure points which are not only known, but at times are also being exploited. Can I have the next couple of slides, please, just in one go? Yeah, thanks so much. So we have 4 key pressure points that we've identified if you drill down and look at these different ways that we respond in this cognitively unique environment. First being the attention economy, which is really sort of looking at this sort of business models, if you like, and the fact that the attention is kind of driving everyone to stay online for as long as possible. Then you have elements of choice architecture, which is actually looking at the way that many of these platforms are actually being constructed and built in and of themselves. So looking at things like default mechanisms, etc. But then you have algorithmic content curation, so things like news feeds, the actual content that you'll be receiving, and the way that that is arriving right in front of your eyes to keep you there for as long as possible. And then last but by no means least, there's the issues of mis and disinformation. Next slide. So really we are looking at mis and disinformation as being online content that is not based on factual knowledge or evidence that misleads. Now, obviously the issue of intent is one that is really important, but we are in this particular report addressing both and making the important differentiation between both. But in terms of our key scientific findings that we found in this work, which is extremely relevant, particularly to the climate crisis, we're seeing that we're currently living in a perfect storm, if you like, because the spread of mis and disinformation is a result of algorithms that are promoting attractive and engaging content, coupled with the fact that people have got a strong orientation to navigate towards negative news. In addition to this, we recognize really importantly that sort of fake news, if you like, for want of a better term, is actually a really small, and this is an important message, a small percentage of the average person's sort of daily media diet. But, and this is really important, but some demographics are much more susceptible to receiving more of this than others. And of course, this can be really important percentages of the population, and we need to come to terms with an understanding what that means when it comes to pre and debunking dedicated strategies. Now, obviously, intent, which is all about disinformation, it's actually incredibly hard to identify. It's difficult to distinguish often if legitimate political speech, for example, from illegitimate content. And this is something that we are trying to work on, particularly with regards to understanding more about algorithmic transparency. A really important insight is the fact that because of this perfect storm environment that we find ourselves in, the misleading content spreads faster and further than true information, simply because the emotions are actually driving sharing behaviours. And last but by no means least, and something that's not often reflected about, but the spread of misinformation is often shaped by the actual networking structures of the social media themselves, which can give, distortions in perceived social signals, which is a really important part and contributes to this unique cognitive environment that we find ourselves in. Next slide, please. And so these are some of the highlights from the sort of previous report that had this deep dive into understanding better this particular environment. But of course, we need to know how to be responding to this. And of course, the kind of sort of initiatives that Hendrik is doing is really valuable. But we also recognize, next slide, please, that the motivation that is actually behind disinformation is not necessarily to be making people believe the actual fake story. Rather, it's to be sowing seeds of doubt and also to be eroding the value that is being placed on facts, as well as the institutions, as well as obviously the science in and of itself. So that's undermining the role of both science and evidence as the basis for policies. So as a consequence of this, in the next area of work that we're doing on meaningful and ethical communications, we have a very strong focus on institutional trust building, whilst recognizing what this looks like from a disinformation perspective. This is a project of 4 phases, which really importantly is, once again, we have the enormous pleasure and privilege of working with experts from all around the world, from many different disciplines, who are providing us with the state-of-the-art scientific reviews. We have commissioned brand new behavioral insights, which is actually looking at the efficacy of framing with values, following the major piece of work that we published last year on values and identities in the political process. We saw there was actually, particularly in Europe, a substantial gap in terms of looking at the efficacy of framing with values, particularly in the EU. So this gap we hope to be filling with this new research and the new data that we're currently analysing. We also have the pleasure of working with institutional partners, institutional communicators, in order to understand from the front line the kind of issues that they are actually being confronted with, so that we can really take this on board. And then last but by no means least, we're going to be conducting some citizen engagement initiatives, basically saying, this is what the professionals are saying, this is what some new research insights are giving us, this is what the latest science is saying. But from a meaningful and ethical communications perspective, is any of this okay with you? Now, included in all of this will be substantial amounts of sort of message testing, case study work that is including the climate crisis. And we are taking that very much into consideration. And this is a key report that we're going to be coming out with in the course of next year. So with that, Jens, thank you very much. And I'm pleased to hand the floor back to you.
Thank you, Laura. In the meantime, we have had some questions in the chat. So one was about the education material. So Laura and Hendrik have already posted in the chat, there's the Digital Education Action Plan. There are also guidelines for teachers and educators on tackling disinformation. So I think this is a good starting point. Maybe we can ask the audience now. Are there any questions? If so, please unmute yourself. Well, if there's no question, I can start the discussion maybe with one thought that I had. So concerning pre-bunking and debunking, that have been mentioned many times in this 1 hour. Are we actually more preemptive or reactive? I would like to ask the other speakers what your impression is. Do we spend more time on being preemptive or reactive? Maybe Istvan, what is your view?
Yes, thank you, Jens. Well, it's not always the same pattern, obviously. It depends very much, I would say, on the topic itself. If we we can give you the example of Ukraine. I know it's not climate change related disinformation, but there we try to already pre-bunk narratives which were genuinely false. So we started our internal reporting already well before the war started. So we try to pre-ban. However, on many occasions it is difficult to forecast what kind of disinformation narratives will come in. So on those, apparently the only thing we can do is to react, and there the aim is to react as quickly as possible. And as it was pointed out previously, it's difficult to know which method will be the best to tackle disinformation narratives. But as Hendrik said, it's basically there are several methods, and we should use one of them definitely. So what we try to do in the Commission is really to forecast where we see some threats in terms of disinformation, or obviously climate change related disinformation as well. And once these narratives are out, then as soon as possible, gather all the relevant information and then propose counter narratives so that our hierarchy, our people in the Commission have something at hand with which they can react, and they have the fact-checked sources they can use, and so I think again that pre-bunking and debunking and reactions go hand in hand. So we should do whatever we can.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we've come a long way from just fixing the information deficit. It's interesting that you mentioned that you want to react fast. So that means also we need to be able to detect that misinformation, disinformation quickly. There was one question in the chat. How does the European Commission make sure that its pre-bunking and debunking activities reach those who do not engage with its official websites and social media accounts? Again, I think this is more for Istvan from communications.
Oh, I'm not sure I understood the middle of.
So the
yes, I see. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, now I see it. Thank you. Well, that's a very legitimate question. So obviously, the social media accounts are very important, but there are not only the European Commission social media accounts. We are trying to reach out also to influencers and also through television, as you saw the UEFA video, which is not genuinely a counter disinformation clip, obviously, but we try to reach out to people who are otherwise difficult to reach out to. A UEFA audience and football match audience is, we think, really one of those audiences, which is otherwise pretty difficult to reach out to with like ordinary European Commission methods, so to say. So what we really try to do is to reach out to as many experts, fact checkers, influencers, academia, so professors, students in the member states as possible. Also teachers. It is available on our Europa website. There's a so-called Teachers Corner, where we have a toolkit for teachers prepared, which would help teachers which is helping teachers to address disinformation issues also in class. So this is yet another method. I completely agree that it's not enough to put information on social media websites or social media accounts of the European Commission or European Union in a broader sense. We are trying.
Thanks, Istvan.
May I just add 2 seconds?
Sure.
And just with the work that we're doing in meaningful ethical communications, looking at public deliberation, and everything that we're looking at is both from an online as well as an offline perspective. And so we hope to actually be able to enrich these kind of discussions further in order to be able to support our communications colleagues better. In that kind of level of granularity in the future, which of course is so important and everyone's wanting to try to crack. Thanks so much, Jens.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, there was another question from the chat. What is the role of fossil fuel companies in spreading misinformation? So for sure, I think what we can see is over the years there is a bit of a trend to go away from climate change denial to downplaying its impact. And what I've shown in the presentation is that really a large part of the disinformation concerns this super narrative that our policies are inefficient and flawed. Yeah, we are aware that there are many narratives about fossil fuels, and from our data, it's fair to say that it's more about downplaying the negative impact on the environment. It's not it's less flat out denial. I don't know whether Hendrik or Laura would like to comment on that. I can ask again to the audience, if you want to ask a question, we have another 1 or 2 minutes. Please unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'll ask the speakers, do you have another hot topic that is burning under your nails?
I think perhaps the enduring message is that the European Commission and all the European institutions are taking this issue very, very seriously, not only obviously legislating in this area, but creating guidelines and working very hard to ensure that it's an evidence-informed response, which is absolutely crucial, and that we're doing our very best and that we can, whilst recognizing, you know, that it's not perfect, but that we're trying to share with others as much as we possibly can along the way, so that others can learn from best practices, but also from mistakes. And that's something that is very much the ethos of this area of work, and why this connected sort of approach by the work that's being led by Istvan also, and the Network Against Disinformation is so important.
Thank you, Laura. I realize that we're at the end of the allotted time, so I would like to thank the audience for the participation in this side event, and all speakers, Laura, Istvan, and Hendrik with me. I think we obviously it's a huge area, and there are many activities, as Laura has just outlined, but I hope that we gave you a thorough introduction into the activities that are carried out by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and our ongoing collaboration with DG Communication in Brussels. I would like to thank you all. Have a great day. Thanks.